As Israeli airstrikes continue to target Rafah, Gazans call for an end to the violence.
We took her from under the rubble, thank God. Was she holding a rocket or was she standing near tanks? What's her fault?
Families of the October 7th hostages plead for the return of their loved ones.
Every single day that goes by is another day that a hostage could die in captivity, or another day where our family members aren't coming home.
And universities across the country grapple with growing pro-Palestinian protests.
Free the students!
Welcome to PBS News Weekly. I'm Nick Schifrin. There is a new proposed deal that would pause the war in exchange for the release of Israeli hostages. The U.S. blames Hamas for the lack of progress in negotiations. But publicly, Hamas continues to ask for a permanent ceasefire. And Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu continues to insist that Hamas must be destroyed completely, regardless of any deal. This comes as the UN says Gaza is so devastated it would take until 2040 to rebuild all the homes destroyed in this war. Amna Nawaz takes a look at the high stakes and complex ceasefire negotiations.
Homes in southern Gaza, nothing more than crushed concrete and twisted bodies. Amid this wreckage, one small survivor, just 2 months old.
We took her from under the rubble, thank God. Was she holding a rocket or was she standing near tanks? What's her fault?
As the barrage continues, pressure mounts for Hamas and Israeli leaders to stop the violence. The International Criminal Court has been investigating possible Israeli war crimes in Gaza. Recent reports cite Israeli officials as worried that arrest warrants may be imminent. On Friday, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu responded, saying, quote, "The threat to seize the soldiers and officials of the Middle East's only democracy and the world's only Jewish state is outrageous." Hamas leaders could also face warrants for the horrific October 7th attacks. Neither Israel nor the U.S. recognizes the ICC, but other countries could arrest anyone with an outstanding warrant. The State Department said any ruling from the ICC would not apply.
On this investigation, our position is clear. We continue to believe that the ICC does not have jurisdiction over the Palestinian situation.
Meanwhile, thousands of Israelis rallied in Tel Aviv calling for a hostage release and ceasefire deal. Hamas has released multiple videos of hostages in the last week, including Ilan Seagull's American father, Keith.
Seeing my father today only emphasizes to all of us how much we must reach a deal as soon as possible and bring everyone home.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken returned to the Middle East for his 7th trip since the war began. At the World Economic Forum in Saudi Arabia, he called on Hamas to act.
Hamas has before it a proposal that is extraordinarily generous on the part of Israel. And in this moment, the only thing standing between the people of Gaza and a ceasefire is Hamas.
At the same forum, regional leaders stressed that peace would only follow a two-state solution. Saudi Foreign Minister Faisal bin Farhan.
In order for us to be able to talk about a sustainable pathway to stability, to security, including for Israel, we're going to have to talk about a Palestinian situation where the Palestinians have hope.
At a meeting of the Gulf Cooperation Council, Blinken pledged to carry that message to Israel.
The most effective way to address the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, to alleviate the suffering of children, women and men, and to create space for a more just and durable solution is to get the ceasefire and hostages home. But we're also not waiting on the ceasefire to take the necessary steps to meet the needs of civilians in Gaza.
Palestinians in Gaza find pockets of peace wherever they can. For some, sheltering in Deir al-Balah, that means a brief family respite at the beach, hoping the waves will drown out the sound of drones overhead. Malek Abrabo brought her kids here today.
Every time there's a plane in the sky, it frightens the kids here. Although I came here to give the children some semblance of safety, fear is fear. Children get scared.
Her husband, little Meyer's father, is still in northern Gaza.
I came to the beach because I haven't been here in 7 months. I came to have fun with my cousins and my sister and my brothers. I don't feel safe, and I hope the war ends so I can go back to my dad.
For now, there is safety on this sand. But just miles away in Rafah, the war rages on.
As Amna mentioned, Keith Seagull is one of the October 7th hostages still held by Hamas. She spoke with Keith's niece, Hannah, about the ongoing fight to secure his return.
So your uncle, Keith Seagull, was one of the hostages in a video that Hamas released last week. You're wearing the number 208 to represent the number of days that he has now been held. As a policy, we don't show those videos, but I just wanted to ask what you thought when you saw him and when you heard his message.
Yeah, it was surreal. I mean, it's the first time that we've seen him or heard his voice in over 208 days. My Aunt Aviva, who is a hostage survivor and was held and released in November in the ceasefire deal, they were held together. And so when she came out, she was able to tell us a little bit about how he's doing. But since then, we didn't know if he was alive or how he was. I think there was an immense sense of relief just to hear his voice and see his face. And it's devastating. I don't know how to describe what it's like to look at a family member in that situation. The first thing he says is, "I love you and I hope you're okay," to our family. And he talks about Passover. And he also talks about hearing bombs nearby. There are so many facets to this and so many ways in which we're worried about him.
There is a moment in the video where he does break down. I can't imagine how difficult this must be for you and your family to watch that, but how did he seem to you after all this time in captivity?
I mean, his voice, it's him. It's him, and that was one thing that gave me a lot of comfort. But he's gaunt, he looks weak, he looks older. He's being held underground. I worry every single day. I remember when Aviva was released, she told me that they were starting to starve. And that was a long time ago. So I think about that a lot.
You know that a deal to release him remains stalled right now. And you said earlier this week something that stuck with me. You said you're not sure, rather, that it's actually in Prime Minister Netanyahu's political interest to make a deal. What did you mean by that?
There have been deals on the table in the past. There's a lot that happens in these negotiations. It's hard to keep track. I'm obviously not on the inside. But from what I do know and from what I've seen, he hasn't made those deals. It hasn't always been clear that he's ready to lean in and prioritize the hostages over anything else. And so I guess what I would say is I hope that Prime Minister Netanyahu prioritizes his own citizens, the hostages, before any political considerations and gets this deal done. I think one thing that we've seen over the last 6 months and frankly, throughout history with Hamas is that the deals don't get better.
You've talked about how supportive the Biden administration has been, how you feel their support and that they are fighting for you and your family. Your uncle is an American citizen, one of a handful of Americans held hostage right now. If you don't trust that Netanyahu will take the steps necessary to prioritize bringing home your uncle and the others, do you want President Biden to start to negotiate for the release of the Americans, at least?
I think we need to see what happens with this deal. I think getting all of the hostages home is and should be the top priority. The Biden administration has made it very clear to me and my family from the beginning that they will do what it takes to bring the Americans home, including Keith. And so I have ultimate faith and trust in President Biden and Jake Sullivan, in Secretary Blinken, and their whole team who's looking to bring these people home by any means necessary.
You mentioned that your aunt, Keith's wife, was freed back during that hostage deal that was made last November. Our audience may remember we spoke to her soon after her release. I just want to ask you, how is she doing today?
Thank you for asking. Aviva's incredible. I mean, she went through something that is unimaginable, and she came out and she decided she was going to spend every minute of every day fighting to get her husband, my uncle, and all of the other hostages out. She is so committed to this and fighting every day. She is a hero. Her strength is, incomparable.
We're glad she's home with you. We hope that your Uncle Keith is home with you soon. Hannah Seagull, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Amna.
As the war in Gaza continues, tensions are rising on university campuses across the U.S. As Amnon reported Wednesday, heated confrontations between demonstrators and law enforcement led to hundreds of arrests in New York, Los Angeles, and elsewhere this week.
Demonstrations at UCLA took a turn overnight as clashes erupted at an encampment of pro-Palestinian protesters when counter-protesters began dismantling plywood barriers around the camp.
Oh, somebody just got ambushed.
Demonstrators kicked, shoved, and hit one another. Fireworks and pepper spray were deployed. It's unclear by whom. Police were eventually able to separate the two groups. By morning, a calmer scene, but all classes were canceled for the day, and many students were left frustrated.
Things are not going well, you know. People are angry at each other. Lots of tensions going on. I just hope things could get resolved. Maybe some negotiations going on. Who knows what will happen, but I just hope things get resolved right away.
Across the country in New York, demonstrations also flared overnight as police removed pro-Palestinian protesters who'd occupied a Columbia University building for more than 12 hours. In a statement today, Columbia President Minouche Shafik said police were called in only after several days of negotiations failed and the building occupation, quote, pushed the university to the brink. She went on to say, quote, students and outside activists breaking Hamilton Hall doors, mistreating our public safety officers and maintenance staff, and damaging property are acts of destruction, not political speech. Blocks away, police faced another group of protesters at the City College of New York. Today, New York City Mayor Eric Adams said about 300 people had been arrested overnight at both campuses and underscored his concern about outside agitators joining in campus protests.
Our goal is to make sure that we tell the right story. There are people that we have been watching in organizations that are not part of the campus. We've been very clear. There are individuals and organizations that are not students. We're seeing a shift in tactics that are being used.
Some students expressed concern about the police response.
It's very difficult for me to say how many people have been injured or exactly how many people I saw getting injured, but we do know that at least some of the police action that we saw yesterday was pretty aggressive.
Larger protests at Columbia University were sparked in mid-April and have since spread to campuses across the country. According to the Washington Post, police have made more than 1,200 arrests in the past 2 weeks alone. Confrontations with law enforcement unfolded at other schools today. At the University of Wisconsin-Madison, police worked to remove tents and made at least a dozen arrests.
This is the Louisiana State Police.
In New Orleans, police arrested 6 people at Tulane University. 7 others were suspended. As protests from coast to coast continue to sustain and, in some cases, grow.
President Biden this week called for calm and said the protests would not cause him to change any policies.
I understand people have strong feelings and deep convictions. In America, we respect the right and protect the right for them to express that. But it doesn't mean anything goes. It needs to be done without violence, without destruction, without hate, and within the law.
As the protests spread, some see parallels between today's demonstrations and college protests of the past. Again, Amna Navaz.
5 minutes to leave the premises.
Many say today's demonstrations echo college protest movements of the past, including against the Vietnam War.
What people in this strike are trying to tell the United States people, the American people, is that the country shouldn't function while this war is going on.
That includes a historic demonstration at Columbia University itself in 1968. Students occupied campus buildings demanding the university cut ties with a think tank involved in Pentagon weapons research. It was met with a heavy police response. Other Vietnam War protests in the 1960s and 70s led to clashes with authorities and mass arrests, but over time they helped to shift public opinion, leading up to the eventual U.S. withdrawal. In the 1980s, a similar movement popped up at universities nationwide, calling for divestment from South Africa to end apartheid.
For more, Amna spoke with University of Texas history professor Stephen Mince and professor and historian at the City University of New York, Angus Johnston.
Professor Johnston, let's just start with what the protesters are calling for here. What is their focus? What do they want as a result of these demonstrations?
Well, it varies campus by campus, but primarily what we're looking at is they're looking for a divestment of the university's financial relationships with Israeli companies, a disentanglement of the universities from relationships with the Israeli government or military, and transparency as to the nature of those relationships where they currently exist.
Professor Mince, what do you make of the demands as Professor Johnston had laid them out? Is that something you think colleges can achieve?
I think they're very unlikely to be achieved. You know, the protests of the 1960s, it was possible to achieve some kind of accommodation. First of all, one of the demands, an end to the military draft, received widespread support throughout society, and Richard Nixon's administration would make that happen. But on campuses themselves, there were some practical goals: Black studies programs, women's studies programs, co-education at the elite private universities, an end to parietals and in loco parentis regulations. There was a lot of ground for accommodation and compromise, and I don't see that much right now.
Professor Johnston, what do you make of that? Do you agree?
Well, I think that the easiest, simplest demand that they're making is a demand for transparency in their universities' relationships with Israeli institutions. And I think that that is something that is certainly winnable on a lot of campuses. I also think that in a lot of ways, the anti-apartheid movement of the 1970s and 80s is a much better analog than the mass student movement of the late 60s in some ways. And I think it's important to remember that in the case of the anti-apartheid movement, the calls for divestment on campuses began in the mid-70s, and it was a very, very long and slow process by which students were adjusting people's views of the crisis itself.
What do you make of that, Professor Mince? Could these protests now start what could be a long chain of changing people's minds when it comes to how they see this issue?
The context today is very different than in the 1960s or 1970s, when higher education was growing and the federal and state investments in higher education were increasing. Today, the situation of American higher education is extremely precarious. Public support has diminished. Funding is hotly debated in many of the states. There are threats in some state legislatures to tax endowments, to tax university property, to tax university income. Donations to many of the leading universities have declined. This is a very treacherous moment, especially for the most well-endowed and highly selective institutions.
Where do we go from here? How do you see this unfolding in the weeks ahead? Professor Mince?
I think the conversation needs to be made more productive. In this country, if you want political change, you build coalitions. And what I'm not seeing on campus right now is an effort to have effective protests that will bring people together. When people hear anti-American sentiments, they are radically turned off. The demonstrators, in my view, should be calling for peace, for the release of the hostages, and an American foreign policy that will really result in a two-state solution.
Professor Johnston, I'll give you the last word here.
I'm really heartened by the fact that despite what Professor Mince has said, a lot of faculty have been turning out in support of these students. Some of them turning out in support of the students' goals, but others turning out in support of the students' right to protest without being harassed and without being abused by cops. I think we are seeing the development of a new coalition on the campus, and I'm very heartened by that. And I hope that administrators take heed of that and do their bit to de-escalate the situation as well.
That is Professor Angus Johnston from the City University of New York and Professor Stephen Mince from the University of Texas at Austin. Thank you both for joining us tonight.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Amid the ongoing trauma of this war, the Jerusalem Youth Chorus is bringing people together in a shared love of music. Jeffrey Bound spent a day with the group, which is composed of Israeli and Palestinian singers, as their performance tour stopped in Washington, D.C.
The Jerusalem Youth Chorus, Israelis and Palestinians, Muslims and Jews. Residents of the same city experiencing life and the ongoing war in vastly different ways, disagreeing about fundamental issues and policies, but singing with and speaking to one another across a great divide. 17-year-old Dalia Jaouni is a Palestinian Muslim from East Jerusalem.
I joined for the music. I stayed because it was so much more.
How is it more?
We have dialogue, we talk. I think if it weren't for the choir, I wouldn't have interacted with Israelis like ever. So it offered me that, and it offered me also a space to share my voice. I feel like as a Palestinian, you don't have many of those places where I live.
15-year-old Hadass Sabah is from a Jewish family living in West Jerusalem.
Because I thought it was only singing, and then we kind of like got separated into groups, and we started talking and like sharing. And at first it was kind of shocking, but it was so interesting.
You said it was shocking at first?
A little bit, yeah.
Because?
It's just things I never thought I'd hear, and people I never thought I'd get the chance to talk to.
It's hard to conceive at this moment of enormous trauma, but there they were amid a recent 4-city North American tour titled A Different Song. A mix of high schoolers and older alumni speaking and rehearsing in 3 languages when we joined them on a day across the Washington, D.C. area. The chorus was founded in 2012 by Micah Handler, a Jewish American, as a project focused on building community through music. Traditional choral training paired with professional, facilitator-led discussions that run from the personal to political. The group gathers once a week, even through the months of the war, its members coming from different parts of the city. But from the beginning, Handler wondered if anyone would join.
I knew from some of the research that I had done that I shouldn't go to schools and try to recruit singers by telling them that this is going to be some like peacemaker program, because everyone would laugh me out of the room. But looking at sort of why young people from East and West Jerusalem might actually want to join a program like this.
You can't go and overtly say, this is about peacemaking.
No, because people will just be like, get out of here. Like, do you understand that that's insane?
Yeah.
You know, but you can say, hey, we've got this youth program. It's an opportunity to learn to sing, to make new friends, to travel the world, to grow your own sense of yourself, to be able to listen to others.
One person who took up the call, Amr Abu Arkoub, who joined as a teen, later studied and practiced law, and is now the executive director of the Jerusalem Youth Chorus, or JYC. A firm believer in its ideals, but also someone who lives the realities of the region.
For me, growing up, I've never shared with my friends that I'm doing this amazing project. And until today, I work at the Jerusalem Youth Chorus, and I'm not very loud about what I do because...
You don't tell people, friends, and...
I choose where to tell, because I need to choose my battles, because many people would view what the Jerusalem Youth Chorus is doing, especially in the Palestinian community, as normalization work, as like, look how Israel is a beautiful country, look how nice we are, Israelis and Palestinians singing together, and life is flowers. But the Jerusalem Youth Chorus isn't that. One of the things that I always say, that being the executive director of the Jerusalem Youth Chorus is the most Palestinian thing that I can ever be doing.
Because?
Because I use the platform that JYC creates to One, help the youth in Jerusalem develop their own agencies as Palestinians and understanding of the situation, because JOAC give me a platform to humanize Palestinians, where many Palestinians are being dehumanized now in Jerusalem and all over the world. And because that I believe that the circle of violence will never end. And we just need to find those who we can be partnered with.
This tour was originally scheduled for the fall, but had to be put off following the escalation of violence. Micah Hendler and Amr Abu Arkoub were determined to pull it off now.
Ultimately, what we're seeing right now is Israelis and Palestinians are both losing. The extremists are winning, and normal people are losing. And that is not a zero-sum game. That is a different type of reality that most people don't want to acknowledge. But ultimately, what we're trying to show, and I think what we are showing, is that there's an alternative, because we are the alternative. We're like, look, we're doing it. It is actually possible, and it is so much better than what is currently happening.
We do not share the same opinions, and it is not easy to come to the square and kind of talk about this. It takes a lot of strength and it takes a lot of courage, but I think we all agree on the fact that the world right now is very, very ugly, and this does not have to be the reality that we live in. We're not going to change like how wrong the system is, but we are going, like, we're building peace between individuals.
For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Jeffrey Brown in Washington, D.C.
And that's it for this episode of PBS News Weekly. From all of us, thanks so much for watching.